The de Mailly sisters were the daughters of Louise de Mailly, Marquis de Nesle et de Mailly, and his wife, Armande Foulis de la Porte Mazarin. Their first daughter, Louise Julie de Mailly Nesle, was born in 1710. She was followed in 1712 by Pauline Félicité, in 1714 by Diane Adélaïde, in 1715 by Hortense Félicité, and in 1717 by Marianne. The de Mailly family was of illustrious origin, and the mother of the five sisters was until her death in 1729 lady-in-waiting to the Queen. In 1734, King Louis XV and his wife, Queen Marie Lesinska, had been married for 9 years. From a young age, Louis was taught by Cardinal de Fleury to observe the religious principles of the Church and understand the consequences of sin. As a result, Louis was faithful to his wife for the first years of their marriage, during which time the royal couple had 2 sons and several daughters. The Queen was terrified by the grandeur of the French royal court and behaved, according to different courtiers, like some escaped nun lost in Versailles. On the other hand, Louis XV was miserable and would not find something interesting to do with his time. About the king, one of his ministers said, "I cannot conceive a man who is able to be everything and who prefers to remain a cipher. He pays not the least attention to what is passing in his kingdom. Nothing seems to interest him. He signs everything that is put before him. It is remarked that in every case he inclines to the course which promises the least amount of trouble, and that is generally the worst one." Such was the state of King Louis XV. He had no friends, no preferences, and no interests. Wanting to bring about a change at Versailles and renovate the government, the intriguing courtiers decided that the king needed to be awakened. When Cardinal de Fleury sensed that the king might be interested in having an extramarital affair, he suggested the name of a possible mistress for Louis. For about 3 years, the king's affair with his mistress happened in secret, and her identity was not revealed until one day in 1737. When the king entered the queen's apartments after he had been indulging a little too much in his favorite beverage champagne, the queen felt insulted that her husband had come near her in such a state and requested him to leave the room. Humiliated by such a treatment, Louis left his wife's room, and on the following day he decided to bring Madame de Mailly to her new apartments at Versailles. So, at the age of 27, Louise Julie, lady-in-waiting to the Queen, became the official mistress of Louis XV. Louise was the same age as the king, and although she was not the beauty of Versailles, she was able to make herself look attractive. All the ladies at court were simply following her in how she dressed. Every night she had her hair arranged in her usual way, and she even went to bed wearing all her diamonds. Her lack of beauty was compensated by her charm of manner and her goodness of heart. She was sociable, witty, and selfless, and was able to capture the king's heart. Louise was not interested in the intrigues of the court, and was never financially motivated. It seemed that the cardinal made the right choice in choosing Louise as mistress for the king. According to the Duke of Richelieu, from first to last, Louise cost the king less than an opera girl would cost a banker. For a while, things went well between the king and Louise, but when the courtiers and even the husband of the king's mistress expressed surprise that the king was attracted to a woman who was not considered beautiful, the king's vanity was hurt and he felt humiliated. When the Marquis de Mailly lost money and property, Louise begged the king to help her father. Cardinal de Fleury intervened and only wanted the Marquis banished. So Louis was in the middle, plus the husband of his mistress had been arrested as a Freemason. The king was not happy. Madame de Mailly was beginning to show signs of distress. Soon she became jealous and started spying on Louis. Meanwhile, her sister Pauline Félicité, who was living in the austere convent of Port-Royal, was dreaming about life at the royal court. With an audacious plan in mind, she started writing letters to her sister day after day, imploring her to invite her to court. As soon as Madame de Mailly did so, Pauline left the convent in a hurry to reach Versailles as quickly as possible in order to oust her sister and become herself the king's favorite. When she arrived at Versailles, the courtiers were unimpressed. Pauline had an unladylike appearance and was far from being a timid, submissive lady in contrast to her sister. But Louis, who was tired of flattery, liked her outspokenness and her rather unpolished manners. Wherever the king went, she kept him company, never leaving his side and always making him laugh. Although Madame de Mailly still kept her place as the official mistress of the king, her relationship with Louis was not going well. Almost immediately, to save appearances, the king arranged for the marriage of Pauline with a young gentleman who was more than enthusiastic to accept the marriage, which took place on the 15th of September 1739. By marrying Pauline, the Marquis de Vintimille offered her a name of respectability. After the wedding, the king gave the couple money and a lodging at Versailles. Day by day, Pauline was busy making efforts to occupy the king and teach him to have a will. She was preparing him to use his royal power in the affairs of the state and in the administration of his household. When she told him to dismiss his servant who was stealing his champagne, the king did so. Before long, the king was under her spell, and daily his affection for Louise was diminishing. Humiliated by her sister, Louise looked on in dismay. Her problem was that she loved the king, so she begged not to be dismissed. Soon Pauline became the ruler of Choisy, a little chateau bought by the king as a retreat where she was served and obeyed by Louis, who was delighted to spend there the life of a private gentleman, busying himself with the renovation of the chateau. Their life was animated with private suppers and social events. In August 1741, the king, who was spending a few days at Versailles, received alarming news about Pauline, who had been seized with a fever. Louis was worried because she was pregnant. A few weeks later, Pauline died suddenly in the king's arms after giving birth to their child, who was later adopted by her sister Louise. Deeply affected by the tragedy and believing that Pauline's unfortunate death was God's way of punishing his sins, the king sank into a feeling of deep sorrow. Even the queen was touched by her husband's grief. When the cardinal preached Louis a sermon on the subject of human weakness, the king fled Versailles and went to a country little retreat. In such a state, he sought the company of Louise and begged her to come back to him. For a while he enjoyed her company, until the Duke of Richelieu plotted to oust Louise de Mailly by choosing a new mistress for the king. She would be another sister of Louise. Her name was Marianne, Marquise de la Tournelle, who was 25 and a widow. The king was fascinated by her, but Marianne lived with Madame de Mazarin, who was the adviser of the queen. The king despised Madame de Mazarin, knowing she was the one who had informed the queen about his affair with Louise de Mailly. The king also never forgot that she had suggested a council to arrange in advance the succession to the kingdom and the queen's regency in the event of the king's death. And so the intrigue began. Richelieu wanted to exploit the ill feelings of the king towards Madame de Mazarin and gain the king's confidence. The opponents of the affair were Cardinal de Fleury and the Count of Maurepas. The cardinal was concerned that the king's will could pass into the hands of a woman whom he might not be able to manage as easily as he had managed Madame de Mailly. In September 1742, Madame de Mazarin died, and Marianne, finding herself alone, with insufficient funds for her needs, accepted the offer of the king's evil genius, the Duke of Richelieu. The queen, who did not know of the place already occupied by Marianne in the king's mind, expressed her intention to offer Marianne the title of the Lady of the Palace. When the king announced the court about the queen's decision regarding Marianne, Fleury and Maurepas tried to frustrate the establishment of Marianne and her sister, Hortense Félicité, at Versailles. Meanwhile, Richelieu skillfully arranged for Madame de Mailly to be ousted by her sister. Marianne convinced Louise to resign her own place of Lady of the Palace to the Queen, promising her a place in the household of the Dauphin. The Cardinal warned Louise that she would be driven out by her sister. In vain he tried to prevent Louise to send her resignation. She followed the advice of Richelieu, thinking that by doing that she would retain the king's affection. On the 21st of September, 1742, Madame de Mailly presented her two sisters, Marianne and Hortense Félicité, to the Queen. At last Marianne was installed at court. 2 months later, the king told Louise to give her rooms to her sister Hortense. He also told her that he was in love with Marianne. Although humiliated, Louise begged to be allowed to stay, but no, she was to leave the court of Versailles immediately. On the dismissal of her sister, Marianne wrote to Richelieu, saying, "The king has assured me that he did not tell Madame de Mailly that it was you who managed the business. You will have been informed of the trouble I had in ousting Madame de Mailly. At last I obtained a mandate to the effect that she was not to return until she was sent for. The king is overcome with grief, and I do not get a letter from him in which he does not speak of her, and ask me to make her return, and say that he will not approach her, but that he begs me to let him see her occasionally. As it would be mighty inconvenient for me to have her here, I mean to hold out." Moreover, Marianne made the king aware that the dismissal of her sister, Louise de Mailly, was not sufficient for her. She wished to be the king's official mistress and demanded that by the end of that year she should receive the title of Duchess. She also arranged the marriage of one of her sisters, who was entirely devoted to her interests. Diane Adélaïde, who had also been briefly involved in an affair with the king, was eventually married to the Duke of Lauragais. All this time Louise was suffering in Paris, and all her letters to the king were returned to her unopened. By the end of December 1742, Madame de la Tournelle was installed at Versailles in the favourite's apartment. She was most of the time helped by her two sisters, Diane and Hortense, to keep the king amused. Hortense was the only one of the 5 sisters who would not become the king's mistress. In 1743, Marianne received the Duchy of Châteauroux, and to that the king added a generous annual pension. Soon the people of France complained about the king's indifference to the country's affairs. Instructed by Richelieu, Madame de Châteauroux convinced Louis XV to put himself at the head of his armies during the War of the Austrian Succession, promising him the adoration of his subjects. As soon as the news of the king's departure to join the army was made public, Maurepas told the king that if he wished to win the affection of his subjects, he must separate himself from Madame de Châteauroux during the campaign. Marianne was in tears when she received orders to remain in Paris. On the 2nd of May, 1744, the king set off to join the army operating in Flanders. The people of France rejoiced, thinking that at last they had found their king. Well, they would soon be disappointed. Madame de Châteauroux rejoined the king at Lille. Richelieu skillfully arranged the meeting between the king and Madame de Châteauroux, who was also accompanied by her sister, Madame de Lauraguais. After that, the king returned to his campaign, and then later that summer he reached Metz, where he was rejoined by the 2 sisters. Their secret was out when 4 streets of the town were barred to the people of Metz. Suddenly, in August, the king was seized by a fever. Day by day his symptoms were getting worse, and a physician of Metz refused to answer for the king's life. The doors of the king's apartments were closed, and Marianne, Richelieu, and Diane Adelaide were carefully watching over the king, refusing anyone's entry. Immediately, a league of the princes and ministers was formed against Marianne and her associates, and eventually she was sent away in tears together with her sister. They narrowly escaped recognition, being pursued by a furious mob who shouted insults at them. Eventually they slipped undetected into Paris, where people were praying for the king's recovery. In September, Louis recovered completely and began to feel rather lonely. 2 months later, he returned to Paris and implored Marianne to return to Versailles. She consented to go there incognito. Her official return would only take place when her enemies were dismissed. The next day she went to Versailles, where she insisted on the dismissal of Maurepas, but the king was keen on keeping that minister. After long discussions, Marianne allowed the king to retain Maurepas, but on condition that she should be allowed to humiliate him. She then returned to Paris to receive Maurepas. On the following day, Marianne was in bed with a cold and fever, when Maurepas presented before her, saying, "The king begs you to return to court and resume your place, and Madame de Lauraguais likewise." But Marianne started to feel unwell, being seized with convulsions. A few days later, in December 1744, without having seen Louis XV again, Marianne died at the age of 27 in the arms of her rival and sister, Madame de Mailly, who forgave her everything. The king was heartbroken. Diane Adelaide, Duchess of Lauraguais, tried to console him. She was by his side for a few months, and then she left the court. The title of official mistress to the king would soon be claimed by Madame de Pompadour.